Welcome to it, guys. Good morning, good morning, good morning. It's the morning highlights. This is Mr. Smart, and we're broadcasting live from Wits. And just tune in. We'll be actually showing all this on YouTube. Your YouTube page will share the link as well. But we are here, and this is all about renaming and reclaiming the names, our names. Tune in, but we'll give you more information. It's Soweto FM, baby. We're doing things, and I told you, for you and me.
Atisafuna mamuna was smarter. Koma wamugata. She want me to give her a daughter. Man, she's hotter. She pull up every day na bima and take me out for dinner. She buy me clothes some bring. Afuna ndimo fake ring. Akundi basa love your nice. Ndeko jidone na kuti bus. She got a pretty face and nice ass. Because society is someone young. I feel a loot boy. Baby, if you do, I do.
But it seems as if I'll be plowing the same field as you have been, program director, because I'll be repeating some of the things that you've already said, but merely for emphasis. Greetings to members of the South African Geographical Names Council, members of the Gauteng government, members of the Gauteng Names Committee, ladies and gentlemen. As the theme suggests, this is a collaborative endeavor between the Gauteng Geographical Names Committee and the Wits School of Architecture and Planning. The panelists will be reflecting on the intricacies of naming and renaming the cities, towns and roads, rivers and mountains of our country in general and of our province in particular. Their papers or their reflections or their views will in effect be about reclaiming our history, heritage, dignity, and pride. The Germans call this phenomenon Emancipation, a sense of belonging and attachment to one's country and its institutions. From a constitutional and legal perspective, the words of the preamble to the Constitution, we the people, are very crucial. Even though our Constitution does not create a hierarchy of rights, the courts seem to suggest, not in so many words, that dignity is the source of all our constitutional rights. Well, obviously, equality comes a close second. That is what naming and renaming our spaces should be about, right? An unequivocal display of our respect for human dignity as the Constitution enjoys this, right? We are being implored and exhorted, right, to rid ourselves and our collective psyche, right, of the assaultive and pejorative derogatory names, right, such as Woka, right? The people of Sidibeng will tell you, right, that name, right, which has since been changed, right, is connotative of imbecility, right, and subhuman traits. That is why we had to get rid of it, right? And the words "we the people" are indicative of the centrality and significance of popular participation in the naming and renaming process. Both the Houses of Parliament and provincial governments are enjoined by Section 58, 57, and 118 of the Constitution, respectively, to ensure that there is popular participation, meaningful and effective participation. Right. So, you know, the members of the GGLC and the SANGC, right, are required where naming, and renaming is concerned, right, to ensure that their decisions are rational, right, are rational in terms of Section 33 of the Constitution, right, and Section 6 of the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, right. So this is important, and the judgments. And I think Mr. Mushala would know about these judgments, right, where the significance of public participation was emphasized and underscored, right. I won't mention them now because of time, right, but I would mention the two that, amongst those that I had mentioned or I have written here. August versus the Electoral Commission, Doctors for Life International, Mirafu Demarcation Forum versus the President and others, Chairman's Association versus the Minister of Arts and Culture. But I will stop there for the sake of time. Thank you.
So, that brings us to, really the core of today, knowledge and getting to know and understand some things that look so unimportant or inimportant. I don't know what the right word is there, but I think I'm going to learn it before the end of today. And so we've got a keynote address from one of our esteemed guests. He's the Deputy Chair of the South African Geographical Names Council, and he's going to be sharing more and enlightening us more on today's proceedings. Please help me welcome Mr. Johnny Mahlala.
Good morning. Good morning. That sounds better. Let me thank the program director and thank the words of welcome from Professor Nand. I don't know how I always find myself in this mess. My wife is very colorful. My life is very colorful. Until late last night, I thought I was going to talk about something. And I get told that in actual fact, we are going to give a keynote address. And I don't know the hell what that means. And that shows you the power of naming. I prefer my speeches to be animated. And to remember a certain World Cup where a known soccer player by the name Diego Maradona scored a goal with the assistance of his hand. And when they asked him what happened there, he said that was the little hand of God. But that's not what the story interests me. What interests me is the events before the goal was scored. An English defender, in his quest to defend the goal, flipped the ball backwards without realizing that somewhere at the back there was Maradona. But Maradona, understanding his incapacity in length, because he shot, extended his hand by putting it on top of his head to extend his height. And he scored a goal that took England out of the cup. But here is the most interesting part. At the end of the game, he exchanged the t-shirt that he was wearing with a player who mistakenly headed the ball back to him. And later, that player sold that t-shirt for £10 million. Why? Because the t-shirt was written Maradona, and it marked an important event in history. If I were to drop my ID now, I'll probably not even get it back because the person will pick it up, will look at it, Rampelane Johnny Bupelo Mufala, and will say, who the hell is this? This guy is too stupid, and throw the ID away. But if someone were to pick up an ID written Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, he would look around as to who is watching and hide that ID and value it. Why? Because of the power of a name. Now, in naming and renaming, what are we trying to achieve? First, the whole exercise is concerned with only one thing: the transformational agenda of the society and trying to become agents of social change. And where do they derive their mandate? During the TRC, it was felt that many South Africans were robbed of their dignity. And because there was no way of computing the loss of dignity in monetary terms, the TRC decided that there must be a way in which, through reparation, people can get their dignity restored. And they suggested this process of naming and renaming. Now, what is it that needs to be done in ensuring that we restore the dignity that was lost by some of you?
Money's a call. All the way for me, man, entertainment.
The second is restoration.
Ndirufuno rwavukuma rwerwatsura mbiruni yangatingarurate. Ndini mufunwa weatsura mbiruni yangatinganiratetsi. Ndingava ndisina millions nji kana dzidola nji kana dzinaira nji ndina rufuno runji.
Thank you so much for the introductions and the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to speak perhaps anecdotally to start with. So my background and experience is very firmly located within the academy and teaching students. And I started as a drama student many years ago. And I want to start there because when I started, there were so few roles for me who wanted to be an actress. And the roles available were, you could imagine, very stereotypical. When I was in a Shakespearean play, I had an opportunity to play the maid, and the lecturer at the time was very insistent that he wanted a particular coloured maid. He wanted the accent, he wanted the sound, he wanted all of the things that we would assume. And I want to start there because it took a lot to resist those assumptions about what it should look like and what role I could play and what options were available for me. So I became interested in what it meant to represent myself differently, but also all of us differently, and the politics of representation. And so my interest in the work became about how we can represent differently. And for me, that's the value of the lens. And as the speakers before us have spoken to, the question of dignity and how it can be measured. So I think there really is value in thinking about how we rename and how we access and allow the possibility for representing differently, and how we represent importantly, along with the people who are more famous in their names, like Robert Sobukwe, but the people whose names we don't know yet. And the value of trying to think about how we access the names we don't know, the experiences that are equally important in shaping this landscape today. And so the work that we do in our courses, in our programs, in our research about accessing those archives, accessing collective memory of community groups and individuals that might not show up in the kind of dominant narrative becomes really important. So the names of women, the names of those within the LGBTIQ community who have played a role, who have been part of the landscape, but we don't know them yet, I would say would be really important and plays a part in thinking about the value of the politics of representation today for us to identify ourselves and place names and experiences.
Why is all this necessary, is your question, right? I think we need to first we need to look at how colonialism and apartheid in the South African context shaped our landscapes. So, it wasn't just about dispossessing people of their land and putting them on 13% of South Africa's land and taking 87% of the land. One of the ways in which colonialism and apartheid were legitimated, naming a place is an assertion of one's identity and legitimacy, and I belong here. So, that's why you had so many, most places named after personage, events, and just important holidays and important things for the settlers. And in naming all these places, indigenous cultures were pushed to the side. They were peripheralized. They were marginalized. They named these places almost as if to say, we came here, civilization begins with us. Meanwhile, there had been indigenous people, and not just Black African people. The Khoi understand. To me, it's all the same. We're all Black, but in all the scholarship, there's a distinction, and maybe that's necessary. I don't know, but all I know is what Black we are. So I think it's very necessary in the sense that our epistemologies as Africans and our ontologies were disregarded. And one of the ways in which that those ontologies and epistemologies and axiologies, cosmologies were disregarded and were pushed to the side was through naming. You see a place like Pretoria. It didn't just come into existence with the advent of the Afrikaners. It used to have a name, Tshwane. We just don't know much about the name. I'm just making an example here. What's been happening? That's what's been happening historically. Our names, or the names that our people have been using for places, have been pushed to the side and they haven't been documented. Even in museums. You had a Voortrekker museum, which just documented Afrikaner heritage. And I mean, post 1994, there have been attempts to have, is it Freedom Square? Freedom Park or something, like on the side. And for me that's interesting. It's like two cultures, a story of like two countries within one country, or two cities within one city, But I go on a tangent. Let me come back to the point. So I think naming is very important because it's one of the ways we archive our history. So history doesn't just belong in museums and textbooks and whatnot. It's also documented. It's also archived through renaming or naming. So these names don't just play a navigational role. I like what you said earlier about something so seemingly unimportant. That's the sense I get from even some colleagues at work, like everywhere. Like people think naming is so unimportant. Yeah, they like to think of names as just things we use to navigate the city, but they play a very important cultural role. And so I think it's very important for inclusion, for us to see ourselves reflected on public space.
Yes.
For women to see themselves reflected on public space, because most of the street names and place names of our cities, even district municipalities, still tell a very patriarchal story informed by hegemonic masculinity. And we need to kind of change that and include other marginalized, people who've been historically marginalized, women, LGBTQ individuals, people of other cultures, even foreign nationals who, because South Africa belongs to all who live in it, to include them because they are, so I could talk and talk for ages, but I think I'll end right here.
And you're definitely running ahead of the conversation because, what I found interesting when I was, just going through the preparation for this talk was the concept of gender representation in naming. And I must be honest, that was something I had never thought of, even with regards to, the LGBTQI plus community. I wondered to myself, okay, what does this then look like? And perhaps Dr. Nicole, you can walk us through that. What does it look like for underrepresented community?
Colleagues, good morning. Mine was sweet and short. I think the reason why naming is important is because erasure has taken place. And because so many histories have been erased, so many understandings and people's identities have been erased, it's important to come together and ask, but whose story do these names represent? And up until we ask those questions and we ask whether those histories are represented accurately. So, for example, if you look at the spelling of a name like Keimus, which is in the Northern Cape, that is not the original spelling of how Keimus should be spelled. It's been Afrikanerized, for lack of a better word. So I think it's important to look at our names and ask, whose history, and is it accurately represented, not only in terms of the narrative, but in terms of the spelling, which is very important.
Thank you. So to your question about how we start to navigate the gendered representation in naming, I think part of that work needs to think about what the implications are for gendered naming. So how do we come to these names? And I know that there are public participation processes, but I think the ways in which we think about what that public participation looks like and what kinds of collective organizing goes into that. And for me, as a feminist, I think it's important for us to think about feminist principles around that. So to really start asking from the ground up, from who the people, what those histories are, before we even decide on which name, or which person, or which history, to go back to communities that we are from, because I also think it's important for us working in these areas to remember that we, even in our positions within the academy, within kind of government, within politics, are from those communities. And to go back to them and to listen to what they're saying, to think about those feminist principles about really interrupting power and going, what do we hear from the community? Whose names come up? How does that fit in with our assumptions about who is important and which histories we tell? So histories of anti-apartheid activists who might have been sidelined because of their gender orientation or because of their sexual orientation. And I'm thinking, for example, Simon Nkoli is not necessarily as well known in terms of people whose names come up when we're thinking about those histories. But even in this instance, Nkoli is a more famous name. There are other people whose names we don't know. And for me, when we're thinking about how do we address the gendered imbalance in terms of renaming, we go back to our communities and we ask them what it is they are thinking about. And our colleague who spoke earlier about really listening with humility, even to the last person, to the people who we might not agree with intellectually or kind of even politically. How do we listen collectively and work from that kind of position going upwards? There was one other thing I just wanted to say in response to the point about kind of how the names help us navigate the cities and the landscapes. I think they also help us navigate our pasts and our potential futures. And that navigation is beyond the geography. It's about trying to think about who we are, where we come from, and where, importantly, we want to go as a society, where we want to see ourselves, we want to see our names going forward.
Thank you. So I moved to a specific gym. I joined a specific gym in 2017. And for many years, while I'm on the treadmill, I'm looking over the squash courts, and I would see white and Indian men playing. And I love racket sports. I play paddle. And I always said, one day I hope to see myself on that court. And lo and behold, in 2025, just to give you the numbers, as I'm giving you the years, we're talking 8 years later, I see a black girl playing. And I immediately go downstairs and I start asking. It was as if I was new to the gym. But I've been seeing these people playing for so long, and this just speaks to the concept of representation and being able to see an image of yourself in certain spaces. That's so important. And I've been playing squash since, lucky me. And I want to speak to what you brought up, Dr. Mogoena, around erasure. And I prefaced with the concept of understanding the importance of representation, because I'm going to play devil's advocate, right? And so one could argue that, are we not erasing a certain part of history when we try to eliminate all of the presence of Afrikaans and Afrikaans culture and Afrikaners, as they did play a role, and what does it look like? Is it possible to celebrate certain Afrikaans individuals of a system that was overall oppressive? Is it possible? Can the two coexist? Where we're celebrating a beautiful building that they built, perhaps, or a beautiful town that they set up, and the individuals, the architects in charge of building things like that, without necessarily celebrating the apartheid system. Can those two worlds coexist, or is it a reminder of oppression? I don't know. Before I give you answers, let me give you a chance to answer.
Before I answer that question, let me quickly just add to this the memorialization of women and how we commemorate them. I think it's not just about whether we name geographic spaces after women or not. It matters which geographical spaces we attach their names to, right? And the status and gravitas associated with that space. Do we attach women's names to less busy roads that are not central to the functioning of everyday life in the city, the byways that we actually go to and we can't be on the highways? Because it's in the name of the highways that the names of the highways are entrenched in our minds, because we hear them over and over again. When Rob Byrne is giving traffic reports, those big names, we want them to be associated with women because it matters. It's not the byways that we say, oh, do this. It's the highways, right? But also the symbolic association of the type of the road, right? So you have your bridges, your Nelson Mandela Bridge, you have your Ben Schoeman Drive. You even have the Gurulis Interchange. Those are big roads, right? But they are not named after females. And so really when we talk about this then, whether we distinguish between a boulevard and a street or an alley, right? We need to be cognizant of the type of streets that we attach women's names to. And I know people will say, oh, by the way, these days, boulevards are just really for upmarket things, or they attach because people want to sound fancy. But even in the sounding fancy, it can sound fancy with a woman's name attached to it, right? And so it's very important, like our speaker was talking about, that we be cognizant of the type of places that we attach people's names to in terms of the status. And your example was of Ivan Khoza and of Teko Modise, right? And so to answer your question, which is a very politically heavy question, I think in the current political dispensation and the way the GNU is set up, we don't have a choice. I don't think we can afford anymore, because if you look at the history of how naming worked, it was really to restore the dignity of Black people. And we did that, and we did to a large extent, and we continue to do that. But unfortunately, because we are a country who claims to be united in diversity, we're going to have to understand what that unity looks like. And unfortunately, I don't think place names are going to escape that type of unity. So I think we get to a point where we understand we can really stay in one country, have different place names that are not, of course, derogatory in nature, but understand that your heroes are not other people's heroes. Your enemies are not other people's enemies. And we can therefore coexist in a geographical space where everybody feels, I can reflect on my hero and still understand that the hero might not be a good person, but it's still the hero. Thank you.
I don't know. Thanks. I wanted to add something, because your question, I actually want to answer the question, but it reminded me of something that I encountered in my research. How do we ensure a kind of accuracy in the naming of our faces?
Yes, I mean, you've given an example of Tswane, and the people say, no, it means we're the same, no, it means it's a monkey, no, it's after a chief, you know. I recently learned that Gauteng, and I've never asked the question because Gauteng is this amalgamation of people from different areas coming to the city to make money, but it was originally a Tswana area, and that's why it's given the Tswana name, and I had no idea, you know. So as we learn these things, how do we ensure that there's accuracy?
Thank you so much, man. Hey, you asked me very difficult questions today. I think as my people have already stated, and I think I've said this earlier, you know, our cultures and one of the ways we communicated, some of the ways we communicated, or, you know, if we were as illiterate as they say we were, there were ways in which we communicated. We were still, that didn't mean that we were dumb. There were ways we communicated. Look at the koi and the sun, for instance. You know, there were those rock paintings. There were those rock paintings, and it's just unfortunate. Today it's just for tourism, you know. But that, for me, that says there was civilization. People knew how to communicate. They understood those things. And now, you know, you also have things like oral histories. Those are some of the ways we communicated. I think those are some of the ways, you know, things like lobola got transmitted to, like, or passed on to the next generation. There were no books alluding to lobola being important or what must happen at a funeral. And I think it's the same for names. So I think, for instance, in the case of Tswane, you have many people who are still in existence, royal people, I think Makosoke or something, who actually are in disagreement with the city, were in disagreement with the city regarding the name Tswane. They're like, we don't know any Tswane figure in the Ndebele community, you know. So I think it's those voices from the ground up that we need to start taking seriously. It's like even with the koi and the sand. their history has become extinct, to be honest, but that doesn't mean that we've wiped out completely. If we could look at the core and the sand citizens, the peoples, the ethnic groups, and actually take their voices seriously. I mean, it's so weird that these are the most indigenous people. These are South Africa's or Southern Africa's indigenous populations. But they've been wiped out in all these countries, Botswana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Swaziland, and so, and none of their languages is an official language. It's so ironic, but I think one of the ways in which we can ensure accuracy is through engaging such communities who've been marginalized and actually taking their histories or oral histories seriously.
I actually apologize for throwing that question at you because it was actually Dr. Cruden's work of collective memory. And perhaps it should have been more directed to you because you also bring up a really lovely point, Mr. Mkhize, when you speak of how things were, the civilization that existed and how things were documented. And we speak about it often to say that African history is documented in storytelling. And usually the storytelling is vague. It's, it's maybe sometimes told in the animals. This elephant did that, and that's a form of keeping history. Sometimes it's in song, and it's in music, it's in poems, and it's in rock painting. But when it's that vague, Dr. Krute, if you can walk us through, when it's that vague, who has the authority to then decide this is what they were saying, to interpret that?
Thank you. So I don't like the idea of accuracy, to be honest.
Okay.
Because my work is around and my interest is around the things that are tentative and unknown and in some cases unknowable. But we look to all of these other examples that you've spoken to in terms of our cultural practice and our kind of indigenous knowledge systems that reside in so many different places. And so for me, the question is not necessarily only about accuracy, but what other kinds of ways can we think about how to name, not about trying to get to the correct past, but to think about perhaps something like relational geography. So how do we understand space as relational as opposed to possessive? Because settler colonialists come in and aim, as Mr. Mkhize said, to rename in order to possess. And some of our indigenous practices were not about possession of the land or the landscape. It was about how we used it, how we came together in relation to the land, how we thought about ourselves in relation to the land. So for me, part of what our work could be about is to think about really trying to underscore that relationality, how we think about names that can reflect those relationships between people, between ancestors, between the land, rather than ownership or conquest and going, we're going to find the right name for this place. How do people use the place now? How do we think about that, those practices on the land as a legacy of how people have always used the land and reflect that in our naming choices rather than who is the right person to name this for? Because I think we're also encountering how hard it is to know who the right person is today.
I like what you're saying. You're really referring to not everything has to be about strong heroes. Not everything has to be named after a date. It could just be how is the land being used there,
And I'm thinking, for example, in Aboriginal practices, when we talk about how Aboriginals in Australia name the land for its purpose for them and its kind of ancestral role it plays, and thinking about Indigenous populations in Canada. So to your point about this kind of global phenomenon, if part of our work is to decolonize, to kind of shift those histories of oppression and knowledge production, we could also look to the land and the places to give us answers as opposed to thinking that we always know in advance what the answers are.
Sure, and you're really speaking towards how when you speak of Indigenous people and consulting them and consulting the way they do things. I remember going to a wedding in Umtata, and the man kept saying, where the soil is red in Xhosa, I can't speak Xhosa. And just realizing that that's how they name things, that's how they name areas, and really considering how the people of that area would then name a place, and it could be something as basic as where the soil is red.
I think the trouble we are going to run into, and I agree with you about this term accuracy, is accurate according to whom and which standards, right? Because accuracy, if you think about it, it's about right and wrong, and what we can prove to be most right and most wrong. And so I remember working in the Northern Cape, and I wanted to find out the nicknames of the towns they had given the towns. Because accuracy from a Western perspective is also very much written, what is written. But we are people of stories, we are people that tell things and you take it by my word that actually happened. And so I came across this idea, and I speak about it in the work that I do, that there's two different naming systems. There's the official naming system that people use so we can write names on signs everywhere. And then there's this oral naming system. And it's the oral naming system that communities use. And it's the oral naming system that communities relate to, because again, they didn't name the street, the place, whatever, to possess it. They used to describe a circumstance. They used to describe how they felt about the place. So I'll give you two examples. There's a town in the Northern Cape called Britstown, named after Brit somebody. And I went there and I asked, what do you call this place? They said Breekirikis. And I said, why Breekirikis? They said, because nothing happens here. The town is dead. Also, it's gebreek. We are broken. And I went to, there's another informal settlement in the Northern Cape. The nickname is Hatful, because the government took too long to build them houses. And if you were the one that most people found funny, it's called Toilet City, right? And of course, when you ask, I remember going to the municipality and asking, why would you call a place Toilet City? Like, we don't know that name. We don't know that name, it wasn't us. If it's the community, please don't involve us. Again, this distancing. There's an accurate name, and then there's this name that these people give this place that we don't know. And I asked the community, why the Toilet City? And they said, it's because the first things they put here were toilets. And then they took so long to build everything else. We needed to get off somewhere. We needed a taxi rank. We needed somewhere to refer people to in the community. And we said, look, it's Toilet City. So we need to be cognizant of when we think about accuracy, from whose perspective. And can two things be accurate at the same time? Can one be accurate for writing and one be accurate for how we speak about this place? Yeah.
I am mind blown by this conversation, I must be honest. Both of you have brought in a really important point that two truths can exist. And I really like the idea, because I think all of us thought of an example in our heads of a place that we know that is called by a nickname. I can think of in the Val, there's a lake of smoking that was built, and it was these corrugated iron sheets, and they called it Sirupisabenya, which is a leg that is shining. It's yabenya, because of the corrugated iron. As you're driving into smoking, I can see the Val people saying, yes, yes, And so as soon as you said it, I'm like, oh my goodness, these things have always existed, and how does it have place in society to officialize these things? To officially name it by the name that people know it. At the end of the day, if you're grabbing a taxi and you want to go to that area and you don't call it Surupisabenya, you won't get there. But to say that it's called Surupisabenya at the municipal office is a lie. And so these are the facts of some of the conversations that we're having. Timani, would you like to weigh in? It looks like you're nodding.
Well, I'm just thinking about, I think as you talk to me, I'm thinking about something I did for my master's thesis last year. I mean, it's something I had always been interested in, and I incorporated in the work, and some of the work I'm doing for the GSRO, but it was just mentioned secondarily, and I just pulled it out, for my master's. And that's the issue of, informal toponymy, informal place naming, unofficial place naming, as embodied by, I think, not just places, formal places, but like informal settlements. And I'm saying this because, even within a formally named place, for instance, in some classes or neighborhoods in places like Maputo, you have roads and places that have formal names, neighborhoods and stuff, but people don't use those, they don't use the formal names. They use some very descriptive names that only insiders know about, So that kind of becomes a way of othering people who are coming into the neighborhood, saying the us and the them, us and them, you guys are not from here. So it becomes a kind of identifier, So I think Sorry, I go on a tangent. I get very excited and
No,
stuff.
no,
Let's
no,
come back to
please.
South
We like the
Africa.
tangents.
So I think your question was around. Sorry, informal.
I actually no, I didn't ask you a question. It just seemed as though you were nodding,
Yeah.
and I was saying,
Okay.
what's your way in? However,
Yeah.
if I am to ask you something,
Yeah.
you've spoken really well around. Now I'm losing my train of thought. You've spoken really well around the concept of naming. We're talking about naming. Informal settlements, informal names.
Oh yeah. Oh, you know what? Let me. Yeah. I also lost my train of thought, but I have it now. Thank God. So I was just thinking about, because a lot of scholars say things, are arguing like in the toponymy thing, not just within South Africa, not just in South Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other places. To say, in the southern city or in the city of the global south. You have a lot of residents concentrated in like the informal settlements, and I just thought, like for instance, think about Nairobi, and they're concentrated in informal settlements which make up less than, I think, 2% of the city's land. And so people are like, scholars are like, why don't we focus on these places? Why don't we've studied so much of like the renaming, for instance, of Nairobi, of Nairobi's cityscape, like the roads and stuff, which happened after Uhuru. Why don't we look at like the names of sub-settlements within the informal settlements like Kibera, Matare, because those names are organic, they're from the bottom up, and they are not top down, they're not yeah. So I think as we were talking, I was just thinking about that we place so much emphasis on the cityscape, that's the built environment, but our people, most of our people are concentrated in townships and informal settlements. And informal settlements are on the rise, it's not just the ones we have that we always have forever. And maybe by 2026 there'll be, I don't know, there'll be more settlements in Gauteng than, so if we are serious about in-situ upgrading, for instance, as the city of Joburg claims to be, perhaps we should think about the role that toponymy can play in ushering, in a sustainable development initiative such as in-situ upgrading for the betterment of our people.
And then, can I just segue? Look, I also found my train of thought. You speak really well of a country for everyone. I think it was you that mentioned that at the end of the day, South Africa is a country for everyone. And we've got the theme of Rainbow Nation, and we want everybody to feel included. An immediate example that I can think of: when you go to China, you're reminded at every street corner, every building, every bit of the country reminds you that you are not belonging here. And I think that that's not the theme and sort of sentiment that we're trying to bring into the South African climate. We want people to feel at home. But under today's theme, of like renaming the nation, gender spaces, identity, heritage in transition, can you speak to where does the buck stop? And anybody can answer this question. Where does the buck stop of South Africans being inclusive and Rainbow Nation? And then where does the part of this is our history, we're proud of it, where does that start? Anybody can just comment on that.
The question reminds me of an opinion piece that I wrote not so long ago around the renaming of Senti Drive to Leila Khaled Drive. Like in my pretentious mind, I thought when it happened, because this is something that goes way back, like it's as far as 2018. But because of all this political change and coalitions, messy coalition politics, it's taken this long to actually materialize. So, when I first heard about this, I think I heard about it in 2023. I just thought there's no way that this is going to get a lot of support, because I was thinking about the xenophobic episodes that we've had in this country, and particularly in Gauteng. But I was surprised to see a City of Joburg media statement saying, support for this, the online participation process garnered more than like 70,000 supporters, and this has made it the largest participation for a name change in the history of Joburg.
Sure.
And I thought, because I thought there'd be issues of misogyny,
Yes.
there'd be issues of xenophobia,
Yes.
but that wasn't to be. But this is not to say that there isn't any of that stuff. You have the SA Jewish community vehemently opposing this. So I think that's the other thing about Rainbow Nation, multiculturalism. Personally, I don't like that term, Rainbow Nation. Because I look at the rainbow and I don't see any shade of brown, I don't see any black, so I don't feel represented by the rainbow. So.
Are there any shades of white?
I mean, fair enough. But so yeah, I don't know whether that kind of answers your question, but I'm just thinking. There are issues. Like, remember, there was a street in Durban, for instance, Ethekwini, that was to be renamed, I think, in honor of Fidel Castro. I'm not too sure.
Okay.
And then there was, mobilization around the name to say, this guy is insignificant to us. He might be significant to you, ANC, cadres and stuff, but he's insignificant to us. Why not honor our own people?
Yes.
So I think those things come up and rear their heads. I don't know whether the heads are ugly, but they have a way of coming up and rearing their heads. And I don't know whether there's a third force driving all these arguments. But in situations where you'd expect them to come up, like in the situation of the Leila Khaled, they don't really come out. They do come out, but not in the way you expected them to. So
And so maybe Dr. Kuji, you can also weigh in on the question to say, where does our inclusivity stop? And where is it? I want to call it exclusion, but just being proud and saying, but can it be our street, Mazibuko Street, please?
So for me, I think the buck stops when we think about names like Toilet City. Because actually that is a name a community is using and identifying as a symbol of failures in terms of transformation. So to our question about this is part of a transition, this is about trying to identify histories and heritages and kind of claim some kind of symbolic relation to that. Claiming symbolic relation to a failure is part of where I think the limitations are around what renaming is. And so I'm interested in those not hidden names, because they're certainly not hidden to the people who are using them, but these alternate names that kind of symbolize a difference of opinion, a difference of kind of understanding about what the value of the name is. Because in that instance, that value is about making clear a failure to my mind, thinking about Zombie Town in Joburg, about the kind of ongoing lack of service delivery in certain places. So that's how people are identifying names for those communities. So I think when we see those names that are coming from communities as resistant to our attempts to overwrite their experiences and to go, this struggle is hero, this name, that continues to perhaps in some ways be a stark reminder for people about how little things have changed. That's where I think there are limitations to that. I still think that then there is value in going back to those communities and going, okay, so let's use this name as the opportunity to shift our engagement. Let's understand that the municipality is going, that's not our name, we weren't involved. Going, that's how people identified, let's use that name as a kind of tipping point to address things. I think the renaming of Santon Drive becomes this tipping point for other things. If renaming can also allow us to shift, not just in terms of celebration and commemoration, but to start allowing names to change things. As you say, you went downstairs because you saw another black girl playing, something changed for you in seeing that moment of representation. Then the work that we're wanting to do in terms of renaming becomes real, as opposed to only in the form of the symbolic.
Sure. I definitely have a follow-up question with regards to what you're saying there. But I think it definitely is time to open the floor for engagement from everybody that's attending today. And so at the sound desk, if you guys could just give me a hands up if there's a mic that can go around. Do you have an extra mic? Hand up, yes, thank you. And then, I want to ask a question, just building off the back of what you said, but I can also open it to the audience members if you'd like to answer or ask a question. You're almost speaking of something that I think is very dangerous in the sense of rewriting history. Is the community not allowed to lament, not allowed to name something the way it happened, even if it's a reminder of something negative? It happened. We're talking about the effects of rewriting history, and maybe perhaps us only celebrating the positives, only naming after the positives, can also have an effect on rewriting. The community should be allowed to lament and say, this is Toilet City. Unfortunately, you let us down, and that's what we're going to call it. I think there is space for that, and is there though? Because then we're not sitting in negativity and wallowing and really. So yeah, I'm also a bit conflicted there, and maybe let's open it to the floor.
Okay. You're supposed to killing the future Timberlake, and we're doing it. I'm with my king, Mr. Smart, with the morning highlight. Culture king behind the cam, Panasekaya. So we understand that and remember, we have information. The corner of Mamo Township, corner of Mamo province, Ajana Namakasi. Melo understand what the Makama Belaga, Jomaka Machaza, Jomaka Mutami. That's one thing that we are pushing right here. Soweto FM, Mzansi and abroad. Sebatingi azama mina mdali uyale nale institutionale nale akulungi mdali bonise ngenze njani Sebatingi azama mina mdali uyale nale institutionale nale akulungi mdali bonise ngenze njani